There are things that are intuitively known to be true, according to the harmonious testimony of universal perception, and without contradiction to any superior principle of knowledge. One such thing is the existence of multiplicity. For in contemplating all existence, is it not immediately perceived? I am not this, and I am not that. But of what is I am not this, and I am not that applicable, but of the many? Therefore, there are things that are many, for the essence of multiplicity is this is not that. Even though there are things that are many, that which is many in some sense is also one in some sense. Even though there are things that are many, that which is many in some sense is also one in some sense. If the many were not one in some sense, then there would be unqualified multiplicity, for there would be plurality upon plurality, incapable of being resolved to oneness. However, what is unqualified multiplicity but an inevitable regress to infinity? Now, a regress to infinity is impossible, because it would imply that the infinite is exceeded by the infinite. But how so? Wherever there is the many, there are also parts in relation to which the many are the many. But when the parts of the unqualified many are found to be an infinite multitude, each part is yet again necessarily found to be an infinite multitude. However, infinity, according to its proper definition, is the condition of being unbounded or without termination. Therefore, that which is properly infinite is incapable of terminating in another thing, and that which is truly infinite is incapable of being bounded by another thing. But if where there is the many, there are also parts in relation to which the many are the many, then each part of the many would necessarily terminate in the other part and be bounded by the other part, in order that the many may be the unqualified many. But the many, in order that it may be truly the unqualified many, must be devoid altogether of oneness. Otherwise, being qualified by oneness, it would necessarily cease to be the unqualified many. But if there is no oneness in the unqualified many, then neither does one part of the many terminate in the other part, nor is one part of the many bounded by the other part. For if there is no oneness about the unqualified many, then there is no one part that stands in relation to another part in any manner whatsoever. Therefore, unqualified multiplicity, my friend, is a non-entity, and all multiplicity is qualified by oneness. But if unqualified multiplicity is a non-entity, then all things that are many are one in some sense. Again, from another angle, if multiplicity were unqualified multiplicity, it would also follow that all multiplicity would be perfectly similar in respect of being entirely devoid of oneness. However, things that are not one in some sense are also necessarily dissimilar, because things are said to be similar only because there is one thing that they share in common. Therefore, Unqualified multiplicity is also perfectly dissimilar in respect of being entirely devoid of oneness. For there is no one thing that unqualified multiplicity is capable of sharing in common. Therefore, in unqualified multiplicity, there is perfect dissimilitude in respect of that in which there is also perfect similitude. However, it is entirely impossible in every respect that things should be perfectly similar and perfectly dissimilar with respect to the same thing. Therefore, unqualified multiplicity is a non-entity, and all multiplicity is qualified by oneness. In other words, if unqualified multiplicity is a non-entity, as we have just demonstrated, then all things that are many are necessarily one in some sense. Yet again, from another angle, if multiplicity were unqualified multiplicity, it would also follow that all multiplicity would be immovable, for every movement is from one thing to another thing. If there is no oneness about multiplicity, and there is multiplicity that is free from all oneness in every respect, then in what manner does unqualified multiplicity pass from one thing to another? Therefore, unqualified multiplicity is necessarily immovable. However, it follows from this that unqualified multiplicity is also necessarily movable. For, being devoid of oneness in every respect, it is incapable of remaining the same, because there is no one condition in which it is able to remain. Therefore, in unqualified multiplicity there is necessarily incessant transition in respect of that in which there is also necessary immovability. However, it is impossible that things should be immovable and movable with respect to the same thing. Therefore, unqualified multiplicity is a non-entity, and all multiplicity is qualified by oneness. In other words, if unqualified multiplicity is a non-entity, then all things that are many are one in some sense. Now, it was already established that unqualified multiplicity is a non-entity. Therefore, a thing is either unqualified oneness or qualified multiplicity. Qualified multiplicity is necessarily one and not one, for to the extent that it is multiplicity, it is not one. But to the extent that all multiplicity is one in some sense, it is one. A thing that is one and not one is qualified in that aspect in which it is one, for it is that quality of oneness that prevents it from existing as multiplicity devoid of all oneness. However, it is impossible that a thing should be qualified by that which did not previously exist in some manner. If there was a time when oneness did not exist, but multiplicity did exist, then multiplicity would be prior to oneness. However, it is impossible that such a multiplicity should be one and not one. For if it is prior to oneness, then there is no sense in which it can be one. However, multiplicity that is entirely devoid of oneness is unqualified multiplicity. And it was previously established that unqualified multiplicity is a non-entity. Therefore, it is impossible that multiplicity should be prior to oneness. It is also impossible that there should not be another that is prior to multiplicity, as if to say oneness and multiplicity could coexist independently of one another. For if all multiplicity is one in some sense, then it is necessary that there should be another that is prior to multiplicity and the cause of multiplicity. For oneness cannot in itself be multiplicity, and multiplicity cannot in itself be oneness, but instead they are perfectly contradistinguished. However, contradistinguished things that exist conjointly are of necessity drawn together by another, for pure opposites do not of themselves tend towards one another. It is impossible that, having existed separately, oneness and multiplicity were subsequently conjoined. For it was already established that unqualified multiplicity is a non-entity. However, even though multiplicity exists, always conjoined with oneness, it is still necessary that there should be a prior cause of the union of perfectly contradistinguished opposites. This prior cause cannot be multiplicity. For if multiplicity is the cause of multiplicity, then of the prior multiplicity the cause is also multiplicity, and of the prior multiplicity the cause again is another multiplicity, and so on ad infinitum. However, as previously established, it is impossible that there should be a regress to infinity. Therefore, the cause of multiplicity is necessarily that which is other than multiplicity. However, that which is other than multiplicity is oneness. Therefore, unqualified oneness is prior to multiplicity. And the principle of all multiplicity is unqualified oneness. If unqualified multiplicity is a non-entity, the existence of which is incapable of being realized, and if all truly existing multiplicity is one in some sense, and if the principle of all multiplicity is unqualified oneness, then it is necessary that every product should in some manner participate in its principle. Therefore, not only is the principle of all multiplicity unqualified oneness, but all multiplicity participates in unqualified oneness. For even though multiplicity is not unqualified oneness, yet multiplicity possesses a certain oneness of its own, which is derived by necessity from the principle of its origin. Now, if the principle of all multiplicity is unqualified oneness, and if unqualified oneness is an infinite multitude, then those products of which it is the cause are also necessarily an infinite multitude. For every principle is thus denominated because it is the cause of a product. And if the totality of principles is an infinite multitude, and if every product that is produced necessarily constitutes an increase in the number of existing things, then it is entirely impossible that the totality of products, considered apart from the totality of their corresponding principles, should be less than an infinite multitude. If, however, an infinite multitude is the cause of an infinite multitude, and if every product that is produced necessarily constitutes an increase in the number of existing things, then the infinite will be added to the infinite. It is impossible, however, that the infinite should be added to the infinite. For the sum of things added is greater in number than the things themselves that are added. But nothing is greater in number than infinity. Therefore, unqualified oneness is not an infinite multitude of principles. If unqualified oneness is a finite multitude of principles, then either there is nothing common in any of them, or there is something common in all of them. If they have nothing in common, then it is necessary that there should be at least one principle that is entirely exempt from multiplicity, and another principle that is entirely exempt from oneness. For if either one were in some sense to have an admixture of both, then it could not truly be said that they have nothing in common. However, a principle that is entirely exempt from oneness could be nothing other than unqualified multiplicity. But it was already established that unqualified multiplicity is a non-entity. Therefore, it is impossible that unqualified oneness should be a finite multitude of principles that have nothing in common. Now, if unqualified oneness were a finite multitude of principles that were distinguishable from one another both according to hypostasis and according to hyparxis, then they would necessarily have unqualified oneness in common. However, if they are distinguishable according to hypostasis and according to hyparxis, being found to differ in number and in nature, then they are necessarily distinguishable from one another by reason of that which they do not share in common. If they share in common unqualified oneness, then they necessarily differ from one another by reason of something in them that is not unqualified oneness. However, if either principle has in itself that which in some manner is not unqualified oneness, yet unqualified oneness is that which is one and nothing but one, then that principle is necessarily other than unqualified oneness. Therefore, it is not possible that there should be a finite multitude of independent principles that are entirely distinguishable from one another. Now, if unqualified oneness were a finite multitude of principles, all of which were in every manner without a cause, then there is necessarily something common in all of them. If there is something common in all of them, it is necessary that at the very least they should all have oneness in common. For if any of them were devoid of oneness, that one would no longer be unqualified oneness, but unqualified multiplicity instead, which has already been proven to be a non-entity. Moreover, if unqualified oneness were a finite multitude of principles, then it is necessary that each of them should be a number, and that the sum of the principles should be a certain number. However, it is in the nature of every number that the sympathy amongst them should be explained by the number 1. For every other number is a certain oneness, which in some manner is derived from the number 1 and depends upon the number 1. Therefore, if unqualified oneness is a finite multitude of principles, all of which have something in common, it is impossible that they should all be principles in the same sense. For as every number is derived from the number 1 and depends upon the number 1, even so it is necessary that every principle should be derived from an ultimate principle and should depend upon an ultimate principle. Therefore, even though unqualified oneness is the principle of all multiplicity, it is not possible that there should be more than one ultimate principle, and it is necessary that this ultimate principle should be nothing other than unqualified oneness. Wherever there is a multitude, there is also number, and it was already established that it is in the nature of every number that the sympathy amongst them should be explained by the number 1. Therefore, it is necessary that whatsoever is mutually shared amongst members of a particular class should be derived from a common source. If there's a finite multitude of ultimate principles, in such a manner that there is no one principle from which all things are ultimately derived and upon which all things ultimately depend, then it is necessary that they should share nothing at all in common. By the very fact that they share nothing at all in common, it follows necessarily that these finite multitude of ultimate principles cannot all be unqualified oneness. Moreover, if they share nothing in common, it follows necessarily that there are only two ultimate principles, one of which is unqualified oneness, and the other of which is unqualified multiplicity. However, it was already established that unqualified multiplicity is a non-entity. Therefore, there is only one ultimate principle, and it is necessary that this principle should be nothing other than unqualified oneness. If the one ultimate principle of all is unqualified oneness, it is impossible that the one ultimate principle of all should also be chance. For the nature of chance is to be unforeseen and unintended. If the one ultimate principle of all were chance, then chance would also be unqualified oneness. If chance were unqualified oneness, then the ultimate principle of all would be unqualified chance. If the ultimate principle of all is chance and nothing but chance, then it is necessary that its existence should be unforeseen and unintended, and it is necessary that its activity should likewise be unforeseen and unintended. Now, it was previously established that substances are said to be similar with respect to one certain thing that they share in common. But if substances were to share all things in common, they would no longer be merely similar, but they would be exactly the same. Therefore, as similitude increases, oneness likewise increases, and as similitude decreases, oneness likewise decreases. Therefore, wherever there is pure oneness, it is necessary that there should also be invariable sameness. Moreover, if unqualified oneness is pure oneness, then it is necessary that it should remain in one and the same condition. For if it were to pass from one condition to another condition, it would no longer be one and nothing but one. If it is the nature of unqualified oneness to remain always the same, and if it is the nature of chance to be unforeseen and unintended, then it is impossible that the ultimate principle of all should be chance, for that which is always the same cannot simultaneously be unforeseen and unintended. Moreover, it is impossible that things should be unforeseen and unintended where there is an inflexible rule according to which all things are perfectly ordered. Now, it is an inflexible rule according to which all things are ordered that all multiplicity participates in oneness. It was previously established that unqualified multiplicity is a non-entity. Therefore, if multiplicity always participates in oneness, it is impossible that the productive activity of unqualified oneness should simultaneously be of the nature of chance. Therefore, it is impossible that the one ultimate principle of all should also be chance, or that its productive activity should be associated with chance. Therefore, if unqualified oneness can be neither an infinite multitude of independent principles, nor a finite multitude of independent principles, nor chance, what is unqualified oneness? The ultimate principle of all is unqualified oneness. but unqualified oneness is the one, and the one is unqualified oneness. If the ultimate principle of all is unqualified oneness, but unqualified oneness is the one, then the ultimate principle of all is the one. And being the ultimate principle of all, the one is God, and God is the one.